Thanks so much for coming to this Lunch and Learn on understanding human rights and disability. We're joined by NASA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity Committee member, Sarah Tregonning, who's going to be giving this presentation today. And it's really exciting because we always like to showcase the knowledge that NASA's own members bring to the table. And Sarah has actually been working with the university for the past 13 years, joined the EDI committee at NASA last year, and sits on the Augustana Indigenous Initiatives Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Committee. And we were commenting before folks joined us that it seems like all of these committees often have very long names and might not be the most accessible to folks. But October is Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is why the EDI committee wanted to kind of showcase what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sarah. But at the end, there will be questions. And we're joined by Andy Lenz, who's a NASA Labor Relations Officer, who can answer any specific questions that have to do with the collective agreement and accessibility. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you and we can get started.
Great, thank you very much, Cole. As Cole mentioned, we're here to talk about understanding human rights and disability. My name is Sarah Tregonning and my pronouns are she and her. And in addition to being on the EDI committee for NASA, and for Augustana, I am also the Student Accessibility and Success Advisor here at Augustana campus. So my job every day entails working with students with disabilities and determining appropriate accommodations and making sure they're applied. So that is working with students who have slightly different legislation, similar but slightly different legislation and processes for their accommodation. We're going to be talking about what is available to employees in the workplace. We want to begin by acknowledging respectfully that we are located on traditional lands now known as Treaties 6 and 7 territory, which are home to many First Nations, Métis, and other Indigenous peoples. You can see Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 here on the map of Alberta. Decolonization, racial equity, and a diverse, inclusive, and accessible workplace for all members are fundamental NASA values that guide us in our everyday work and decisions we make. We encourage members to reflect on their own relationship and responsibility to this land, and we will continue to be an active partner with these and other Indigenous allies across Turtle Island, so long as we are welcome. So North America, traditionally known as Turtle Island. I am coming from you to you from Camrose, which was traditionally known as Assiniquo-Sapesis or Stony Creek, and was a traditional home to the Musqueam, Nehewak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, as well as Métis and other Indigenous peoples. So those are the people traditionally connected to the land that I am currently on. And so it's very exciting when I get the opportunity to learn from Indigenous knowledge keepers here at Augustana. So the learning goals for today include being able to better define both disability and accessibility and understand how they're important when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that reminds me, the closed captioning has been turned on. So if you want to see closed captions, if you go to the menu in your Zoom there and click on live transcript, you will be able to see the captioning. We want to better understand human rights legislation and the university policy related to disability and accommodation. understand the way barriers are built into our workplace structures and systems, and understand ways these barriers can be reduced or offset to allow for better accessibility and equity. So we're not here to come up with solutions to every barrier, just to increase our awareness. So I want to open it up to you in the chat. What words come to mind when I say the word disability? Accommodations, yeah. Mental illness, disadvantage, universal design, neurodiversity, challenges. Okay, this is really interesting because, yes, not every disability is visible, and a lot of the things you've mentioned are part of invisible disability. So I'm glad that there's that awareness. So it's important to remember, first of all, that there's a difference between referring to someone as a disabled person versus someone who has a disability. Referring to someone as a disabled person really is giving them a term that suggests that that is all they are, and that it is representative of their whole being. If we say someone has a disability, that indicates that it is not their defining characteristics and that it is just something that they have. It is not all of them. It's also important to remember that even people who have what we might consider severe disabilities are still very able. Often when we talk about disability, especially when it's visible, it is the first and only thing many people will see. But the fact is that if you are working with someone who has a disability, they obviously are very able and capable of being employed. Another issue with disability is that in many societies, and especially capitalist societies, we determine people's value as human beings based on their productivity. So people who do more, produce more, are considered more valuable. And even the term that used to be applied to people with disabilities, particularly physical disabilities, was invalid. Someone was an invalid, which is saying that they are invalid as a human being. This is actually a really flawed way of looking at people and looking at ability and disability. And it is one of the things that contributes to barriers in our everyday environment. This notion that productivity equals value. So physical disability is what most people think of first, although in this group, it is not what people thought of first. And it's defined in the Alberta Human Rights Act as any degree of physical disability, infirmity, malformation, or disfigurement that is caused by bodily injury, birth defect, or illness. So pretty broad. Some examples of physical disabilities, and this isn't an extensive list, but these are physical disabilities which have led to accommodation in the workplace. So some examples include epilepsy or seizures, heart attack or heart condition, cancer, severe seasonal allergies, which I don't think people think of as being something that could be accommodated, back or shoulder injury, amputation, movement disorders, so whether that's a tic, whether that's something like MS, other functional limitations to how you move your body, someone being blind or low vision, or someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. Communication disorders, so it could be that somebody struggles to speak or can't speak and relies on sign language. Hysterectomy, this is something that should be accommodated in the workplace. Asthma, Crohn's disease or other gastrointestinal disorders, systemic disorders. Color blindness is not something we think of as needing accommodation, but actually it qualifies, and there can be really important reasons to accommodate for it. Substance use disorders, these can be defined as either physical or mental disabilities, but they are worthy of accommodation. Things like arthritis, muscle atrophy, or recently long COVID. Long COVID requires accommodation, but it's also unique in that it's so recent and we know so little about it and how long it lasts that it is one of those things that while needing accommodation, there's less certainty about how to go about accommodating it. So you mentioned mental illness as a disability. How do we define mental disability? According to the Alberta Human Rights Act, it's defined as any mental disorder, developmental disorder, or learning disorder, regardless of the cause or duration of the disorder. So it's important to recognize the duration aspect because it could be something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is lifelong, or it could be a recent depressive episode or panic attacks, something that's not necessarily permanent, but can be having a really big impact on how you do your work. Most mental health conditions are not visible, as we've said, or measurable in the way physical disabilities are. So what I mean by that is because it's not something that can be tested with blood work or an x-ray, it's often considered less valid, or there's more stigma around it because it's not something that's so obvious as a broken leg. People don't know how to tell whether someone has a mental health condition. And it can often be dismissed or belittled as with comments like, well, everyone's a little crazy, which is a very problematic sentence in many ways, because A, it's not true. B, the use of the word crazy is a negative. It shouldn't be used. Or people saying, well, it's not that bad. Yeah, you're depressed, or yeah, you're anxious, but toughen up. It's not that big a deal. You should be over it by now. It's not having a big impact. So it can be very difficult to have it recognized how significant it is. It's also, while physical disability often operates on a continuum, mental health and mental health disability or mental illness also operate on a continuum. So you can think of very healthy to at risk to injured to ill, where the severity increases and therefore the impact also increases. What does disability look like? Kate mentioned a very important part to talk about too, which is neurodiversity. A lot of things that are currently defined as disability, like ADHD, like autism, other conditions which could be considered neurodiverse rather than disability, that is starting to shift. But the impact of that shift is very slow. So most disabilities are invisible. And the World Health Organization did a study and found that actually 15% of the world population has disabilities, which is a very significant number. But it is actually lower than other studies. So a 2017 Canadian study found that 22% of people over the age of 15 had at least one, if not more, disability. And the percentage of people with disabilities increased as you got older, up to 47% of people who were 75 or older. Disabilities reported in the Canadian study related to pain, flexibility, mobility, and mental health. Those were the most common ones that were reported. And the study found that the more severe the disability, the more likely the person was to be living in poverty, to be underemployed. So they had skills or they had degrees which would qualify them, but they weren't able to get those kinds of positions because of their disability. And so they were forced to work in other areas that didn't maximize their potential, or they were not able to work at all. It's important when we talk about disability, and I'll be honest, I don't love the word disability. It is the term used in most legislation and policy, but there are a lot of negative connotations to do with that word, and I prefer to say something like physical or mental health conditions. Condition has a variety of meanings. It's not necessarily negative when you hear that term. So it's more inclusive and less, to me, judgmental. But disability, or how we view health conditions, has different lenses. So the medical model of disability states that an illness or disability is the result of a physical condition which is part of that individual's own body and which may reduce the individual's quality of life and cause clear disadvantages. And someone mentioned disadvantage as being part of disability. It focuses on the individual's deficits, and the response to disability is to try and prevent, treat, or cure the condition. So I am the person with a disability. I need to take medication. I need to possibly have surgery, but I need to do something to reduce or prevent this condition. This tends to lead a lot to stereotyping, and because it views the responsibility for the disability as the person's own responsibility, it actually increases disability because it doesn't acknowledge that we interact with the environment around us. And sometimes it's not us that's creating the problem, it's the environment. So the social model of disability acknowledges that society has been built for people who are 100% able-bodied in every way, shape, and form. It acknowledges that disability is separate from impairment. So I may have a visual impairment that affects how well I see, but it doesn't become a disability until it interacts with the environment. So the social model looks at systemic barriers, negative attitudes, and social exclusion that actually make it impossible for people with impairments to fully function in society. If you build stairs as a way to get into every building, you have now built a barrier and created disability for people who can't use stairs. Now, that includes people with mobility limitations or who use mobility aids, but it also includes mothers or fathers, parents pushing strollers. It includes people who have to bring oxygen with them. We're creating a barrier that doesn't have to exist. We've just built it that way. And it means that some places and spaces are inaccessible. Our activities are limited not only by whatever health condition we may have, but the environment around us. So one thing that happened here at Augustana a few years ago, a new performing arts center was built on campus, and they built it from the ground up. So it was a good opportunity to make the space as accessible as possible. So they did do some things. They made the sidewalk really easy to get up onto, lots of curved, ramped spaces, but they also put in stairs. So they could have built the entry as being entirely ramped, so a gradual incline as the only point of access to the building, but instead they chose to build steps, which are what you find at the front main entrance. And then they put a ramp off to the side, so you actually walk around one half of the building in order to access the ramp and then get back inside the building. And so with that choice, when there was opportunity to make it completely accessible, they made a choice to make it inaccessible or less accessible. So what does human rights legislation say? Here in Alberta, we have the Alberta Human Rights Act, and it states that no person shall deny to any person or class of person any goods, services, accommodation, or facilities customarily available to the public. This includes in the workplace. We cannot discriminate against any person or class of persons with respect to any goods, services, accommodation, or facilities that are customarily available to the public because of the race, religious beliefs, color, gender, physical disability, mental disability, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, or sexual orientation of that person or class of persons, or of any other person or class of persons. So this also includes gender identity and expression. This is the foundation of the Human Rights Act. And this is what is the basis for requiring accommodation. So under the Alberta Human Rights Commission, accommodation means making changes to certain rules, standards, policies, workplace cultures, and physical environments to eliminate or reduce the negative impact that a person or group faces because of a characteristic that falls within protected grounds. So here we're focusing on disability, but this applies to all of those other groups we just mentioned too. So family status, source of income, gender identity, faith, religion, ethnic background, all of those are included. And all of those also intersect with disability. The way someone experiences their disability is going to differ based on their gender, based on their marital status, because married people tend to have more support for their disability than single people do. Your race or ethnicity can make a huge difference in how you experience your disability. So all of these things intersect. The university has a duty to accommodate. That is their responsibility. It requires the participation of the employee. So if I am requiring accommodation, I need to be part of the process of providing reasonable accommodation. So So it's a shared responsibility. The Act states that while accommodation may cause inconvenience, disruption, or expense, it is still required by law up to the point of undue hardship. Now, undue hardship is a bit of a legal term. It can be seen as a bit vague, but the main thing to remember for us as NASA employees is that a university with the size of budget that this one has, it is almost impossible for them to for them to prove undue hardship, certainly when it comes to financial costs. It's important to remember that accommodation leads to a more diverse and inclusive workplace for all employees, not just those receiving accommodations, because it encourages employers and other employees to think about how things are done, why they're done that way, and whether they need to continue to be done that way. Once we start thinking about adaptation, accommodation, accessibility, we start recognizing how much things can be changed, how flexible things can become, and that more people than just the employee with the disability or health condition can benefit from these changes. Accommodation requires assessment of the person or group's needs and always includes the employee and the union also in that process. So this is not something that should be done to you. This is something that is done with you. One of the upsides of the pandemic is that we were able to recognize that most people could work from home and work from home very successfully as long as they had the right tools. This has actually opened a lot of doors when it comes to accommodation in the workplace and allowed for a lot more flexibility of thinking. Even access to things like these lunch and learns has opened up a lot because we're now providing them online. The university's duty to accommodate policy states that the university is obligated to make reasonable adjustments to the point of undue hardship or as required by law to the conditions of employment in order to reduce or eliminate the impact of discriminatory rules, policies, practices, standards, terms of employment or decisions which may have an adverse impact on an individual or group of individuals based on a characteristic or perceived characteristic referenced in the protected grounds. So this policy falls under the discrimination, harassment, and duty to accommodate policy. And it's important that those three things are grouped together because they often go hand in hand. There is often discrimination against people with disabilities and a failure to accommodate that leads to more discrimination. They're connected. So it's designed to foster and protect a respectful work environment free of discrimination and harassment. And it supports dignity and equity for all members of the community. This is the designed intent of the duty to accommodate policy. So let's look at, we've mentioned accommodation. What do we mean by accommodation versus accessibility? So again, I'm giving you the definitions right out of the policies. Accommodation refers to making reasonable adjustments to the conditions of employment in order to alleviate any adverse effects on persons that result from the application of rules, policies, practices, standards, terms of employment, or decisions due to a characteristic or perceived characteristic referenced in the protected grounds. It's a shared responsibility between the university and the employee. The onus is on the university to initiate the employee has to request the accommodation, but the university is obligated once it's obvious that an accommodation is necessary. The important thing to remember is that it requires reasonable accommodation, not instant accommodation. This is a lengthy process typically for employees, and it doesn't require perfect accommodation. So rarely do we get the ideal version of an accommodation. You may try different options when it comes to accommodation to see what's going to work best, both for the employee and for the employer, the university. Is there a limit to accommodation? So we talked about undue hardship being the limit. Undue hardship may be shown if the financial costs would hurt the viability of the service, program, or institution. Again, for an organization the size of U of A, it's almost impossible to show undue hardship due to financial cost. So even if you needed a sign language interpreter for every hour of every day that you worked, the university would be unlikely to prove that was undue hardship. It has come up with students in the past, and it was not considered undue hardship, even when it cost $1 million. Undue hardship can be shown if an accommodation would significantly interfere with rights of others. Again, there are usually adaptations or solutions that would protect the rights of others and still allow the accommodation. Or if accommodation would place others at risk. Again, there's usually a solution that does not place anyone at risk, but still allows the employee to receive accommodation. So how are these actually provided? What do we do if we recognize that we need accommodations? It's based on each individual's diagnoses and how those diagnoses impact our life as an employee. Different people require different accommodations, even if they have the exact same diagnoses. So if you and a coworker both have the same condition and both require accommodation, it might look very different. The same way, if all the people who wear glasses, if we were to trade glasses, we couldn't necessarily see wearing someone else's glasses because they don't suit whatever our eye condition is. They don't suit what our vision needs are. They're designed for that person, not for me. Accommodation is the same. So typical accommodations may include time off work for extended illness or surgery, recovery. So that includes our general illness coverage we get through university, through the NASA agreement. It also includes the casual illness, or when it's longer than 26 weeks, long-term disability. It includes modifying the work environment. So we might do an ergonomic assessment. We might need to increase space, open space in an area to allow for wheelchairs to pass safely through or mobility aids to pass safely through. We might need to create access for service animals and adjust an office environment to allow for a service animal to be there. We might need to provide adaptive equipment. So some people may need standing desks so that they can alternate between standing and sitting. Some people might require chair lifts to actually physically lift them out of the chair so they can get to a standing position. That is a reasonable accommodation. Ergonomic keyboards, vertical mouse, an extra large monitor or a second monitor. These are all adaptive equipments that are reasonable accommodations. It also might require modifying duties or responsibilities or adjusting work hours or where we work. So, of course, the pandemic, most of us worked from home and showed that that was easy to do, or it was an effective way to work from home. So we might need to work reduced hours or work from home part of the time or all of the time. Who does accommodation actually help? The problem with accommodation is that it only supports one person at a time. So you're giving this person glasses and this person glasses, but everybody else is still functioning in the same environment. It's usually only applied if the person lets their employer know or the union know that they require accommodation for protected grounds reasons. And there may be a lot of reasons why people aren't comfortable bringing that up, or because the type of health condition that they have, because it is considered so minimal to most people, it might not be recognized by someone as something that could be accommodated. We might just see it as something we have to just deal with. So if you are aware or have reason to suspect that an employee has a disability that is impacting them as their work, the duty to inquire immediately kicks in. So for example, if one of your colleagues arrives at work with their dominant hand in a cast, so they went home from work Friday, no problems, they came back on Monday, and now they're in a cast, and it goes right up to the fingertips. It's immediately obvious that that person can't do their computer work the same way they have been doing, depending what other activities are part of the job. It's obviously going to impact how they perform those duties. So we need to inquire and refer to get the accommodation process started. So what do we do? You can contact the labor relations officer or your union representative, notifying them of a condition requiring an accommodation need. We do need to provide medical documentation, especially if it is for a longer term condition or if it is a permanent condition that is going to permanently impact how we do our jobs. So we work with the disability service provider, which is Homewood Health. And the documentation must include a notice that we are unable to perform our regular duties due to illness or injury. It needs to include a prognosis for full recovery. So this person has long COVID. Because of the symptom severity, they're unable to do their job. The prognosis for full recovery may be unknown at times. So you could put unknown, but will be reassessed at this date. A date of reassessment must be included. Limitations or restrictions that need to be accommodated. So it could be that someone with long COVID is able to work, but at a reduced number of hours, or only work from home for this many hours a day. How long are these limitations expected to continue? Now, obviously, if someone is in a terrible car accident, they lose a limb of one kind or another, that limb is not going to be able to be reattached. They may get a prosthetic limb, which will eventually allow them to do possibly everything that they did before, but the duration could be a really long time between when they lose the limb and when they get a prosthetic that is functional, that they're able to use well enough to resume regular duties. So there could be quite complicated information in this documentation, and it might need a lot of reassessment. The documentation is then going to be assessed by Homewood Health, and a return to work plan is always going to be created. And that is something that we as an employee have to accept, the return to work plan. If something seems unrealistic in the return to work plan, we may need to get additional independent medical assessment. So if the plan or the assessment by Homewood Health doesn't agree with how we feel, what we feel is accurate, or what our doctor feels is accurate, then they may request an independent medical assessment. If that independent assessment disagrees with what the doctor has said, then a third tie-breaking physician might be consulted. So it can be quite a lengthy process depending on the situation and condition. So starting early is always better. If you can work but have restrictions, adaptations to job duties or equipment should be made to allow employees to continue to work in the best way reasonably possible. And if it's not possible to continue in the previous position, there's just something, suppose you were in housekeeping, which requires a lot of physical labor, and due to a severe back injury that's really just not going to repair itself, you just simply can't do that type of work anymore, then an alternative position at a similar pay level should be offered in replacement. That's the accommodation process. Accessibility is different. I gave the example of the Performing Arts Center. Accessibility refers to the degree to which physical and administrative structures of the university are designed or redesigned to enable the full, meaningful, and equitable engagement of all of the university's community members. So with the centralization process that we have been going through lately, some things may have become less accessible, more challenging. So some of these processes that we've been going through have actually increased disability by decreasing accessibility. It includes more than ramped access to buildings, although that was the example I gave, and more than designing for physical, financial, sensory, social, and language level access. The goal is to reduce as many barriers in the environment as possible while creating efficient and transparent processes for individuals to gain the accommodations they are required and entitled to by law. So you can see the big difference between accommodation and accessibility. They don't provide the same things. They don't serve the same people. Accommodation views each person as an exception to how things should be done, and it still designs everything for the perceived norm or dominant culture, the able-bodied person, basically. Accessibility says we need to do things a better way because everybody benefits from doing things a better way. So increasing accessibility actually includes designing the organization to have fewer barriers and more alternatives for everyone, not just those with disabilities or health conditions. The way we've designed many things in the organization has made them inaccessible. So here we go. Let's look at some of the barriers. We'll start with something obvious. So what in this picture presents a barrier? The height of the doorknob. Good point. Yep, the fact that there is a doorknob. No electronic means of opening the door. Yep. Yeah, so this is a round doorknob. They're often harder to turn, so if someone has poor fine motor skill or low muscle or muscle atrophy, it can be hard to actually turn the knob. There's no electronic means of opening the door. The door opens, looks like out, possibly in. So there is a wide area that it has to cover when it opens, which means it could be opening into you. And so you have to be able to back up and open it and then get through it. What about this door? Is there a difference with this door? Better handle. Yeah, absolutely. It's much easier and you need much less manual dexterity and muscle to open a lever type of door handle. But again, you're still having to pull it out and be able to get through and get around the door in order to come in. Someone mentioned no electronic means of opening the door. So here we have electronic means of opening the door, but what barriers might be present here? Yeah, you still have to be able to push the button. And some of them, there are some push buttons on the Augustana campus, and I'm sure on North Campus, that the button may not work. Some of them you push them and push them and push them and nothing happens. But also some of them you really have to push hard and hit in just the right spot for it to actually work. The button may be in an inaccessible location. You're right. This is kind of far away from the door. So whoever is pushing this has to be able to move quickly enough to get to and through the door before it starts closing. And again, these are doors that open out, so they require a great deal of space. Speaking of inaccessible buttons, how about this one? This business seems to be complying with the letter of the law. They have put a button to open the door, which is at the top of the door. Anyone who is in a wheelchair could not possibly reach this button. Yes, very high up. Giraffes only, exactly. The giraffes can come in, everyone else, mothers pushing babies, people in wheelchairs, short people, children cannot get through there. What about this door? Yeah, laughable. Yeah, exactly. Worse than useless. This door has a couple of advantages that the other doors we looked at don't. For one thing, it's motion sensitive, so it's activated by being present in the space. There is no button to push. It slides, so there's nothing coming out at you. So people coming through, whether they're pushing something, if you're shorter in a chair, either way, the sensor is angled down towards the floor. So if it's been done right, anyone going through, whether they're a 2-year-old or 4 feet tall or 8 feet tall, everyone should activate that motion sensor and let the door slide open. This is also great because in terms of disease transmission, like the pandemic, nobody has to touch anything to make this door open. So it's actually doing a lot of health promotion and illness prevention for every single person. I'm going to skip that because I see we're running out of time. So I am going to look briefly, though, at one example. So someone with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, this is a neurodevelopmental disorder commonly considered a disorder of the executive functions of the brain, which regulate intentional, goal-directed problem-solving action. People with ADHD may find it challenging to reduce impulsivity, to behave appropriately in all situations, to stay focused and attentive and resist distraction, and regulate their own activity level to the demands of the situation. It also make it feel impossible to become organized, to remember appointments or important information, to be on time or be productive. And this is something that a lot of people work with, but don't consider that they could be eligible for accommodation because of this diagnosis, because it has a big impact in how you do your work. So some things that could be done, well, sometimes it can be hard to focus attention long enough to read through things. But if you have access to things like text-to-speech software, being able to read them and listen to them at the same time can increase attention and focus. Providing speech-to-text software so you can dictate emails and written documents can be really helpful. A lot of people with ADHD report that their thoughts go much faster than their ability to type or write. So allowing dictation allows people to get their thoughts out quickly enough that they don't forget them. Allow someone with ADHD to have more of a distraction-reduced work environment. So instead of, having all glass walls and windows around them, let them put the film on the windows, let them create a low distraction environment, so low noise. Keep the room simple, reduce the lighting. All of these can help. You might allow the employee to set their own schedule to take advantage of peak function hours. Often people with ADHD do not function well earlier in the day. If they're taking medication for it, it takes a while for that to kick in. So peak function is often 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. But we have arranged our workday to be 8:30 to 4:30, or in the summer, 8 to 4. That means that someone with ADHD might only have a peak performance for 2 hours of the workday. So do they need to work those same hours, or can they adjust their hours to take better advantage of when they're working their best? Can they organize their work in a way that makes sense to them? We have so many processes and procedures for everything that require multiple steps. It's often more challenging for someone with ADHD to navigate. And because they find it more challenging, they might just not do it, right? They might do 1 or 2 steps, get discouraged because it's so complex, and just stop. So because we have built so many parts of university work that way, we're making it more difficult for people to do things and follow procedures. And with centralization, we may have made it more difficult for people to know who to talk to get assistance navigating all these changes. So clearer lines of reporting, clearer lines of communication to know who to go to for assistance are really important. How can we be supportive? Think about the words we're using. So not crippled by or victim of or suffers from. These are all negative connotations that the person might not feel negatively about their health condition. Person who has, person with. Not lame or mobility impaired, but you could say limited mobility. Normal. There's a lot of associations with the word normal. If you mean able-bodied or non-disabled, use that word. Hearing impaired, deaf or hard of hearing are the terms that most members of the deaf community find acceptable. Retarded, or mentally handicapped, these words are all negative. They are almost never used correctly. So if you mean a person with an intellectual or developmental disability, you can say that. We need to recognize our own able-bodied privilege and treat people with disabilities as valid and deserving of respect and acceptance, including ourselves. We might want to offer help, but wait until it's accepted, because some people may want assistance, some people might not, and they may want different kinds of help. If you're talking to someone who uses a mobility aid like a wheelchair or a walker or a white cane or a service dog, never touch those things without their permission. Those aids are an extension of that person's body. So it's the same as if you touched someone's neck, someone's wrist, someone's foot. It's very invasive. Always talk directly to the person, not to their friend or their helper or whoever else is there. People with disabilities often don't get spoken to because they're not seen as able to respond. It's important that we treat a person with a disability or health condition as they want to be treated. So just because someone has a functional limitation, it doesn't mean that they're sick, it doesn't mean that they're incapable, and it doesn't mean that they can't speak for themselves. If someone has a communication disorder, don't interrupt, but listen attentively to people when they talk, especially those who are hard of hearing or have communication disorders, where we're often tempted to say things like, well, take your time, which actually puts pressure on the person because it indicates that we think you're taking too much time. And it also, we tend to try and jump in and help someone speak for themselves or finish their sentences, where really it's okay for us to just listen and wait. We need to recognize each other's strengths and abilities and how important they are to that person or ourselves. And don't confuse disability with stupidity. This is unfortunately something that often happens. We see disability as less intelligent or less able, and that's not the case. So to become an ally, notice things around you and think of what barriers they might present to others. Look at the door you walk through every day to get to your office. Think about how this process for getting an honorarium paid might present a barrier to somebody else. If you notice someone struggling or being bullied, feel free to approach them and offer assistance. Be there to be supportive. If you have leadership opportunities, consult with people with disabilities. The saying is never about us without us. That absolutely applies in any decision-making situation, because every person with a disability will be impacted by every decision that's made. And be supportive of those you know, but let them speak for themselves. So the big things to remember, and I realized I filled the time, creating accessibility for people with disabilities creates greater accessibility for everyone. Acting with kindness and respect is always best in any situation. And accommodation is necessary and required by law. So don't be afraid to ask for accommodation. Even if you're not sure if it's something that can be accommodated, it is worth checking out.